The Founding Fathers, American Revolution, our Constitution, our history, America. Thanks so much for tuning in as we discuss the people, places, events, and battles that turned 13 separate colonies into the greatest nation on earth, the United States.
Welcome, Patriots. Today is a pretty darn cool episode. And for those of you listening on my podcast, you're going to enjoy this episode. If you want, you can watch this video interview with Kostya Kennedy. He is a crazy, crazy cool guy. And I read his newest book, which is obviously why he's here. He talks about Paul Revere, the ride, Paul Revere, and the night that saved America. And as you guys might know, I delved pretty deep into characters, and I will say there are several things that you brought to light about Paul Revere and that evening and some of the events surrounding that I was like, wow. And that's what I love, because there's a lot of books about Paul Revere. There's a lot of stories about him, but I think you really set the record straight. But let me just tell you a little bit about Kostya before we begin. He's a former senior writer and editor at Sports Illustrated. He also authored True, the 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson. And as well, he wrote the New York Times bestseller 56, Joe DiMaggio and the Last Magic Number in Sports, and Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. All 3 books won the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year. He has taught at Columbia, and he lives very far away from me in New York. So we have an expert and a great, wonderful author, and we're going to get to know more about him and his book. So welcome, Kostya.
Great to be with you, Ron. Looking forward to talking.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself, other than all, I only read just a portion of your many accolades, but like, what do you like to do if you're not, writing books or doing what you do?
Yeah, so my life, I guess professional life, I'll say, is I work at Dot Meredith, which is the company that I was initially at Time Inc. Books, where Sports Illustrated was at Time Inc., and I spent a long time at Sports Illustrated, covered baseball, covered hockey, covered pretty much everything, and then moved into the books division, and now I oversee that division here, although it's not really a books division anymore. We do single topic issues, the kind you might see at your grocery store, or at a Walmart, and I do them under the People brand, under Time Magazine. It could be anything from an issue on Harry Potter to an issue on autism to an issue on Disney to anything that, a huge range of topics. And that's really, Ron, it's been a great blessing for me. It's the most interesting job I've ever had, as much as I loved traveling around and writing about sports for a while. Here I really get to cover such a range of topics. And it's really a lot of fun. I mainly oversee that, so I'm not necessarily writing on all these topics. That leads me to the books I've done always as part of my career. You mentioned the baseball books. Baseball is a big love of mine. And but those books also, the DiMaggio book set in the summer, big element of social history in it. The last summer before the war, certainly you have to have some interest in baseball to like the book, but it's not entirely a baseball book. It's also a book about it being an Italian American and being a person in the summer of 1941 in America. So moving over to the ride and Paul Revere was kind of a natural move for me. I guess I focused it all on work. I have 2 wonderful daughters, and my wife and I live in Westchester County, New York. We like to kayak, we like to go to the movies, and we like to travel. So maybe we'll come out to Idaho one day.
Hey, yeah, please do. We'll give you a tour. So you said that going from all your baseball books that you've written and going over to Paul Revere was a natural transition. To me, I was like, well, how is that natural? Because you're going from a sports figure that you can watch maybe movies or old footage and TV and listen to how they talk to people. Like, that's the detriment of my topic is I only can read and really, that's about it. There's no video, there's no photographs, there's paintings of some. But what inspired you to say, hey, I want to write about Paul Revere?
Yeah, so you're right. There is that dissimilarity, but there is also, and maybe we'll get to this a little later, but just in terms of archival research, there's a lot of similarities, especially if you're going back as far back as I went for. There really was no TV in 1941, for example, when writing about DiMaggio. Obviously, there was more record keeping than there was in the 1760s and 1770s, but it was something similar. He's such a the event and the figure has always had such a hold on me from a long time, both personally and I guess I'd say emotionally and intellectually. The emotional part is I can remember, as probably many people can, being 8 or 9 years old, well long enough to read on my own, but still love being read to, and sitting up in my bed at night, my mom sitting beside the bed, reading to me, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere," the great Longfellow poem. And no pictures, Ron, right? No pictures. Mm-hmm. At least in the version that I was being read. Like there are books that have pictures, but so it was left entirely to my imagination at that point. And then when I started sort of thinking about it, it stayed with me, and he seemed such a relevant figure. You see him sort of adopted by the right and the left, right? So you'll have somebody for like the new a Christian group calling themselves the Paul Revere of Pennsylvania, and then you have Greta Thunberg holding up 2 lanterns as a warning for against climate change, and you really just see a broad range of people invoking him, and that's probably because, or in one such a seminal event that he's so associated with. Like you couldn't really do that with George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. Like there's too much about them. He's a little more like Rosa Parks or somebody, like known for one particular. Even though he led a very long and full life and contributed in many ways to American history, as you know, and maybe we'll talk about. But his whole legacy really boils down to these few hours of his life, and him knowing what time it was when he did that. Right, this was the moment that he was going to leave his legacy, and all of those things just began as I began to think about it and began to wade into it. Was just really had a lot of appeal to me.
Cool, very cool. And you're right. I mean, he is known for the Midnight Ride, mostly probably because of the poem, and I think people might have a few misconceptions or a lot of misconceptions about that ride. They picture, excuse me, Paul Revere riding. I'll ask you in a minute what the whole purpose was, but they think he rode everywhere, told everybody that the British are coming, which he would never yell because at that time they were all British, right? And he got off his horse and he saved the day. But he was one of 50 plus riders, and Sybil Luddington, the 16-year-old girl, rode 10 times longer than he did and didn't get caught like Paul Revere did. But it is one of the most famous parts of American history, and especially during the Revolutionary period. What, in your opinion, is the biggest misconception that people have about that night?
Well, I think there's 2 things, and I think that you might have articulated a little bit just even in your setup there. One is, of course, that he was a lone rider out there doing it on his own. Now, that's a misconception, but he was, by any measure, the principal rider.
For sure.
And if you're going to do a poem about one person, it was going to be about him.
Yeah.
And not only that, there was one other person, William Dawes, who was sent out, and Dawes doesn't appear to have actually alerted people, or at least people from the towns he went through aren't on record of having made it to Concord and Lexington. But the other riders were all set in motion by Revere. So it's not as if he was one of many, but he was the spark that ignited it. The lanterns went up in the tower, and some people may have seen that in Charlestown and begun. But then it was Revere going through all those areas and spreading the word and telling people, and then people got on their horse and went here, and then they got there, and so on, so that there were 40 riders just sort of fanning out over the countryside. but he was the one who got on, and he knew what he was doing, right? He didn't take his pistols that night, because if he did, and the British found him, he could have been a dead man. So he knew the risk he was taking. He knew how hard it was just to get out of Boston. And one thing I want to say about Sybil Ludington and other people, what a wonderful story, a 16-year-old girl, right? This was 2 years later, right? And it wasn't as if, Revere went out. There were British men on horseback and a ship set up specifically to stop this kind of messengering, and specifically to stop Paul Revere. Not only him, but he was the principal rider of the revolution. So in 1773, when they wanted to get word of the Boston Tea Party down to New York and Philadelphia, it was Revere who went. In 1774, he went up to Portsmouth to warn of what they thought was going to be a British attempt to take gunpowder from a store in Portsmouth. So he was the guy. It wasn't like it happened to be him. He was the Babe Ruth of the enterprise. Yeah. And something like Ludington, I looked into it quite a lot. Whether she rode and how she rode is a little bit in itself apocryphal, perhaps, some of it. Mm-hmm. She was a real person who lived, of course, but a very different circumstance. And I'd say that we might have only heard of her because of Revere. And by that I mean that almost every time you read about Sybil Ludington, it's the female Paul Revere. Well, she ran longer than Paul Revere. He's the he's the benchmark, right? He's the figure. So I think what happened, the initial misconception, that's why I said it's sort of two things, is that it was just him, but it wasn't. He was part of his whole network, and he worked for Samuel Adams, and he was sent out by Joseph Warren, and he was doing the bidding of great minds who organized in this thing. But then I think sort of the naysaying or the opposite side of it is to sort of say, well, he wasn't just one, but he was the figure, right? And he was, again, like if you're going to know one rider, one express rider, one sounding the alarmer, Paul Revere is the one to know, and he's the one who made the biggest difference. Yeah,
well, and he wasn't, a dummy. He had connections everywhere, so he definitely, and maybe if it was somebody else as the key rider, maybe they wouldn't have gotten through, because there were, like you said, ships and roadblocks, and I mean, he had to know his way, and not only that, but the back roads through the towns, and I mean, it is pretty fascinating. And in my research for podcasts, and I'm writing a historical novel about my fifth great grandfather who fought in the Revolutionary War. When you start diving in and looking and reading about people or reading what they actually wrote, I'm one of those nerds that love to read diaries of John Adams and every other founding father. In your research, which had to be immense, were there any discoveries or lesser known facts that you discovered that you were like, wow, I didn't know that? Were there anything like that?
I think I don't know if there was sort of a mind-blowing single fact. I think the nature and character of Revere as a figure, and I'm not going to say this wasn't known, but it became clearer to me, sort of all the things you said about the way he rode, his preparation to that night. I call the book The Ride, and everything I've chosen to include about his, so it's not a cradle to grave biography. Everything is meant to be in service of the ride and getting him to that point in his life when those hours were going to change things for him.
Do you want to plant the seed of patriotism early? If you've got little ones at home or know somebody who does, check out my new book series called The Young Patriots Series. Now, these books are not only fun, but they're beautifully illustrated that really bring the founding fathers and mothers to life with their simple stories, timelines, famous quotes, and even coloring pages. You can learn more and order them at patriotpowerpodcast.com.
and sort of seeing his life, when you look at the other great leaders of that time in Boston, so Samuel Adams, as you mentioned, John Hancock, of course, very wealthy, John Adams, Joseph Warren, and so on. These are, people who went to Roxbury Latin, and then they went to Harvard, and they were thinkers, and they had family wealth. They had a long generations, in some cases, of being there. Even William Dawes, the other writer, had been there. Revere was not a privileged person. He was a smart guy who went to like a regular sort of writing school, didn't go to college, worked with his hands. He could make you a bowl as a silversmith. He became a dentist, and he could really ride a horse. This guy knew what he was doing on the back of a horse. And that he got so close to the elements of power. Like he identified Joseph Warren's body. He named his son, the first son who was born after Joseph Warren was killed at Bunker Hill. He named him Joseph Warren because Warren was as good a friend as Paul Revere ever had. And it seems that he was sort of the everyman who sort of rose up to be with these great leaders and great thinkers just by dint of being a man of action, being an intelligent, no mincing words, describer of things. And I think that notion of his personality, and of course, then he went on and became a bell maker and rolled copper and adapted to the changing world. That's probably what impressed me, I think, the most.
Yeah.
I
think he, and I think people go, "Oh, Paul Revere, he did the ride that warned people." But yeah, you're right. I mean, he was a silversmith and businessman, and you go into great detail. And wasn't he the one that created the Boston Massacre? I can't think of the name, the template or whatever. Anyway, he drew that out, and it became, well, everybody knows it now, almost probably as famous as his ride, which he was a pretty good propagandist, because every single thing about that painting, I'll call it a painting of the Boston Massacre, is 100% inaccurate, right? It was done at night. His is showing in the day. There was snow on the ground. This is like the middle of the winter or summer. So it was very different, but he had a lot of impact on American history and the message of standing together and getting united, I think, than just the Midnight Ride. But the Midnight Ride was critical, because had he not succeeded, I mean, who knows where we'd be now. I mean, in the Boston Massacre, you're absolutely right that he engraved several things. There's a few others that are fairly famous, of like the British boats in the harbor. None is more famous, as you said, in the Boston Massacre. But he actually didn't paint it. He engraved that. So engraved it. Yes. I couldn't think of the word.
Who came up with the concept, who came up with that vision of it. And he took somebody else's work and engraved it and put his name on it, right? There was some dispute about it a little bit, but he had a much greater network of getting things out. Absolutely part of the propaganda machine. So he was involved he was on the boat at the Boston Tea Party and Painted Face, right? So he was involved in the revolution, in the rebellion, basically as it began. He was the son of liberty. He was in the Caucasus that met and plotted. He was part of a spy network that followed around when the British were quartering in Boston in the mid 1770s, before 75. He was deeply involved in all those ways.
Yeah, he's and maybe you encountered some of this. Had many episodes about many different people, and I kind of follow a chronological timeline, but I also do bonus episodes about people. And I can't remember if I've done one about Paul Revere. I think I did about the ride. But when you start delving in to somebody's life, I mean, the people back then just seem to have been at the right place at the right time in history. Because, if somebody dove into your life, they would find amazing things. If they dived into my life, they would find a different set of, and the more you look at somebody's life, the more interesting or crazy, I guess it can be. But it seems like everybody back then that you dive into has just these amazing stories. Do you think it's just because it was at the time where we were trying to gain our independence, or it was the beginnings of the United States of America? Because everybody back then just seems to have these amazing stories, and Paul Revere is no different. Why do you think that is? It just happened.
Well, I think two things. I think two things. Obviously, the people when we're thinking about it and talking about it, even if you do you obviously know your history very well, and even if you do a deep dive and look at all different people, we're still only seeing a fraction of the population, right? The tiniest fraction, right, whose stories have survived. So for their story to have survived, there probably is something noteworthy about them. I think that all of those people very much knew what time it was, and same with the people on the British side. So Thomas Gage and Pitcairn and the British generals. Yes, we were all British, but I mean the Crown. The people representing the Crown and the Royal Army, people were aware that this was a time, and it had been building up since the late 60s, since the Stamp Act, and since the British had sort of come into Boston. So a lot of things were documented. Just simple discussions were documented. People were more likely to sort of keep diaries and get them out there. There's a few excellent surviving diaries that tell you a little bit. And some of this I found very interesting, and just sort of used it to sprinkle in as best I could, just about everyday life, about what it was like, to be a farmer then, right? And to have to forge a path or lay down a footbridge or whatever it was in daily life, and how much of life depended upon daylight. Then there was, of course, there was electricity came just after this, and then took a while before it was really widespread, of course. But there wasn't a lot of light beyond what the sun gave us, or the moon in some cases. So I think that it is, as you say, it was the time in history, and it's the people that have survived over the years that give it that aura, and why it is so interesting, and can be so interesting just to think about how life was.
Yeah. What do you think, if Paul Revere could see your book, if he could see how he is remembered today, what do you think he would say about that? Can you? That's a tough question, but
yeah, no, it's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. It's a good question. I think he would be proud of it. Although he was also fairly self-deprecating. Part of the reason why we know he was the one who was asked to give depositions immediately and then later on. And so much of what is known about his actual experience is from his own description of it. We might not have even known about William Dawes, the other writer who was sent out, if Revere hadn't mentioned that he was sent out, and that led to more knowing about him. At one point, he referred to himself as a mechanic, and that's a term that now obviously it's more associated with automobile fixing, I think, in today's world, but we know what the term is. But he was really what people, even in the late, when he gave this account, it was 1798, people would have referred to him as an artisan, not as a mechanic. A mechanic was kind of a little bit of a coarser, more vulgar term of sort of a lower class person, for better or worse. That's the connotation that sat around the word. Right. And that's how he viewed himself, as just one of the people doing the job. And he suffered no fools, he told, and people asked him something, including when the British soldiers who stopped him that night, the royal soldiers, they said, "What's going on?" He just tells you. He doesn't. He just tells you, "Here's the deal. I'm going out. I know you guys have sent out 800 men across the boat, and I wish I could have shot them all in the head, but instead I'm riding around to get everybody." He gave the news clearly. John Adams had a great quote, which in context, maybe you'll get it just from how I say it, but in context it was so powerful. It just said, "Paul Revere will give you the news." Yeah. And it just meant, it had this almost like, I don't know, Walter Cronkite element to it. Yeah. Like, he's going to tell you it with no frills. He's not going to spend a lot of, he's not going to extrapolate or anything. So I think that I think he'd be proud of what he did. He was proud of it. He was very protective. Some of the things we don't know exactly is the names of the people who he initially spoke to, because people were afraid to have their name out there then. Now it's like, oh, they would be heroes. But at that point, many people, I can't have the
You'd
royal,
be a traitor.
right?
Yeah.
You'd be a traitor. And you could be obviously severely punished. So, and he protected people, right? So he would say, I met a friend, I met a gentleman, or something like that. Often they use the word friend.
Canva presents your work horoscope for this week. Deadlines are in retrograde, which we all know can bring some intense energy. Our advice: fend off this forecast with Canva. Like Canva whiteboards to counter creative blocks, and Canva docs for clarity in communications. If you have any sales deals coming through, results will be in your favor with Canva presentations, manifesting many wins for you. It's a great week to love your work at canva.com.
Hey guys, back at the playground again, huh?
Yep. You know what this playground could use? A wine country.
Heck yeah, and some waves so we could go surfing. Oh,
I love that.
A redwood forest would be cool.
I'm in.
Ski slopes.
let's do it.
Can a girl go shopping?
Yeah, baby.
Wait! Did we just invent California?
Discover why California is the ultimate playground at visitcalifornia.com.
And that was, he's not alone in that. That's sort of the words that were being used then, and the way people kept some anonymity. But I do think he was aware that it was the signature event. And although it gained prominence much later with the poem, even in the one of the lanterns of Revere's lanterns is on display in the Concord Museum, which, if you stop to think about it, sort of like, why is it? It was hung in Old North Church. It was never seen in Concord. It's way, way too far away. It's 13 miles away. It was just seen in Charlestown and maybe some places around there. What's it doing out here? Well, it initially got there and it passed down to some families because somebody went there and bought it as sort of an artifact in a few years after 1775, knowing the significance of it, or sensing that it would be significant. Yeah. So they knew in the time, it's not all myth making. They knew in the time what a crucial ride this was, what a crucial night, of course, that was for the future of America.
So when I with my book that I'm writing, and it's not about my book, but it will set this question up. So my fifth great grandfather fought in several 6 key battles, Long Island and others. He got injured, shot. He was only in for 6 months. He was from German descent, so he didn't keep a diary, right? So we know a lot from John Adams and Jefferson and, of course, Washington, because there was so much that they wrote, and also that so many people wrote about them. Nobody knows my great Peter Kern. He was a private, and he may have been, near Washington. I have no proof of that. So I have to balance historical fact with drumming up what I think he would have thought, or what somebody in his position was thinking at the time. Did you have any difficulty? And I don't see it in your book. I think you do it marvelously, but how did you balance storytelling without losing the historical accuracy?
So one thing that I want to approach is, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist all my life. I try to be a storyteller. So that was my goal, right? To have it told in a way that you could come along for the ride, so to speak. Yeah. But of course, bounded always and entirely by facts and the narrative as it was. And I think I alluded to a little before that some of the things that helped were diaries and descriptions of the town and the area. The weather, for example, was heavily chronicled in those days. It was a big deal when it was a full moon, because it meant a difference to your life if you could go out or not. It was a big deal when it was no moon, right? So that's just one little element. But to bring in some of the things out to the side of the main event that would color it, to understand how their kitchen must have worked, to understand how when he went out to see Hancock and Adams staying at the Jonas Clark house in Lexington, where they was hiding from the British, to understand what that house was about and that life was about, and that there were as many cows as humans probably in Lexington in those days. So that's what I sought to do, right? And there were times when you have to make a judgment, and I always make that clear and say it may have been something you can know, and I'm using air quotes but don't see it for sure, simply because they've been documented in several sources and it seems very reliable. And other things, you make an educated best judgment and use that. And I think that, I said earlier, like everything is in service of the ride. And you probably find this too, maybe not specifically about your grandfather. When you're doing a book, and this is true of all the books I've done, you come across so much information, and you can always write more than you include. And I would try to be very judicious about it, only if it was in service ultimately of the ride and the implications of the ride would I include it. Now, that might be a job that Paul Revere held as a bell ringer at the Old North Church at age 15, because, and the chapter goes into it, it obviously has a connection to the ride itself. But I didn't worry about, finding out how he did in school that day kind of stuff, right? Because that wasn't so much important. So I think that's the way, trying to be as focused as possible on the task at hand, and then bring in as many elements as you could to try to get there.
Well, you do. I mean, and my listeners know me. We obviously just recently met, but I'm pretty blunt, and good or bad, I just say it how it is.
Good.
But your book, I read it. I read it in a couple days. It has this flow that is so easy to. For me, it was so easy to jump in the saddle and be with him throughout the ride and everything else. It was just so, I don't know, if that's a style of writing. I mean, I throw words on a page and my wife makes it sound good. But there's just an easiness about reading this book. And you do that so well. That's why I wanted to find out, because I'll get books from people. This is all I read. American Revolution. That's all I study. That's kind of my sickness or my addiction. But and there's nothing in here that I was like, oh, that's not right. In fact, there was more times I was like, really? I mean, I've studied Revere. I know Revere. I feel like I know him, right? And I'm like, man, there's some good stuff in there. So I loved how I felt that there was nothing inaccurate, but your storytelling and weaving those two together was just like, it was fantastic. If you could go back in time and witness just one moment of his ride, just one segment, what would it be and why?
First of all, thank you very much for the thing that you said about the book. It means a lot. I know you're somebody who reads a lot and is in here, so I really appreciate that. Now that is the real question. If I could go back to one moment of the ride, there's a moment early on in the ride when he encountered a couple of British soldiers, and this is long before hours before he makes it to Lexington and then subsequently is captured, where he encountered a couple of British soldiers, and he can see that they're armed and they see him. And I'm telling you, everybody knew the name of Paul Revere. They knew Paul Revere's name in London, right? He'd been riding for the revolution and they wanted to stop him. They didn't necessarily know him by face. There was no TV. There weren't really pictures of him in the papers in those days, were just long sheets of words, right? So, but it was a critical. He knew that he couldn't be caught, and his getting away at that moment, and his description of it, that they paused and they were there, and you can imagine it, right? It's that there's no other light except for the moon and the stars. And there's two of them, and there's one of him, and they have guns, and he doesn't. that maybe I think would be a moment that I would have liked to see, because it was almost ended before it really began. It had slightly begun, but it ended almost before it began. And then, you'll find out for those who read the book what happened, but obviously he continues on. And that was one of the moments. But honestly, I would have loved to have been sitting in his saddlebag the whole time.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah.
And I always think of when he got away from those two, I wonder if after the fact those two realized what opportunity they had at the time. Who knows? Probably nobody. Yeah. So it's kind of cool to play those what ifs. But I think I would have liked to see. That was a pretty good. I'd probably choose that one, or when he actually reached the house, just to see. That you go into great detail in the book. Do you think there's any lessons that we can take from his ride that are applicable to today? I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Is there anything that we can take from what he accomplished and what he did and persevered through that we can apply to America or people in general today?
I think that being aware that a single act can change your own life and your own legacy, and can change the course of history. And a nonviolent act, right? Yeah. So not an act of and not even an act of hostility, an act of gathering, of rousing people, right? So whatever that might be in one's life, and very few of us have some reason why we have to warn them something like that. But whatever it might be, when you know that your time is at hand, to be able to seize that moment, that was something that stayed with me. And I will say we talked earlier on about what connection to my other books it had. It is a little similar, and I don't know if people know about baseball and stuff. I'm not going to go into it too much, but when Joe DiMaggio was having his hitting streak in 1941, he hit in 56 straight games. And for this man, in his time on Earth, this is what transformed him from being a baseball player, a very, very good baseball player, to being a superstar who we're talking about 70 years later, who, just like everybody knows Paul Revere's name, pretty much everybody knows Joe DiMaggio's name. And there was certain similarities in temperament and in being able to see, this is my time, and it's happening, and I'm going to seize it and do it. So there was something almost inspiring, I think, on a personal level there.
Yeah, for sure.
The other thing, and this is not unique to Revere, it's true of many people at that time, but he had a pretty successful business. He had 5 kids. His first wife had died after giving birth. He's now in a second marriage. It was a wonderful marriage that they stayed together until her death many, many years later. What I'm trying to say is he had a pretty good life, and he probably would have been just fine, regardless of the British involvement. The British wanted a little more tax money, right? They weren't coming to lock people up, and it's basically we were all friends, kind of arguing about money and control. Right. And he was in a position of relative comfort and success. He didn't need to risk any of this for his personal gain. Yeah, he's risking it for an ideal. And again, that's true for many others. Certainly Joseph Warren and many of the others we've spoken about. He's not unique there. But that's an impressive thing. It would have been very easy, and certainly many people did, to stay on the sidelines. Many people did not stay on the sidelines, of course. But so that also was a impressive thing.
Do you want to plant the seed of patriotism early? If you've got little ones at home or know somebody who does, check out my new book series called The Young Patriots Series. Now, these books are not only fun, but they're beautifully illustrated that really bring the founding fathers and mothers to life with their simple stories, timelines, famous quotes, and even coloring pages. You can learn more and order them at patriotpowerpodcast.com. Yeah, that's excellent point, because I think today in today's world with technology and being connected, that it's supposed to bring us together. I think it might be doing the opposite effect. However, I think with so much access to information and so much availability worldwide, I think people don't believe that one person can make a difference in a good way. And I never thought about it until you said it so eloquently, is this one act. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't shooting. It wasn't violent. It was, he was being a text, right? He was a future text and letting people know. And that's awesome. But I think today people say, why does my one vote doesn't matter, or what could I possibly do? And I think if those that love these topics and our founding fathers and mothers, I think there's so many lessons to be gleaned from them. And yes, they were at the right place at the right time and all of that. However, George Washington didn't need to do anything either. Thomas Jefferson didn't need to do anything either. John Adams, he didn't have to risk his entire career by representing those involved in the Boston Massacre. And you just I'm in awe of all those people. Revere, he wasn't that. The ride was not a violent thing. I love how you say that. That's going to stick with me for a long time, actually. There's a lot of lessons and great tidbits and information in your book, but if there's one key takeaway message from the book that you would want others to get out of it, what would that hope be for the reader?
I think a little bit of what we just talked about being aware of your moment and being confident that you can make a difference. But I also think a level of sobriety in there, I would say, and I say this today, I'm sure there's people on this podcast, just as in everywhere in the world, from all different political positions and all that. These were not hysterical men. These were not, and women. Sadly, the men get documented more, but there were many very, very important women involved in
Agreed.
These people were not. They were not yelling and screaming and calling each other names for no reason. It wasn't. They were arguing passionately about something they disagreed with. They were arguing about British control, but it wasn't a lot of name calling. And they were friends, right? The Massachusetts Artillery Company trained together, loyalists and patriots, side by side until the last days of 1774, right? You didn't hate a loyalist. You didn't, it's like they didn't hate somebody from one political party or another political party. They weren't exactly political parties then, but you understand.
There was definitely two sides, for sure.
Definitely two sides. But there was sympathies for the other side, and there was empathy for the other side. And, the British were wrong ultimately, but they weren't, they'd funded the war, the French and Indian War, and spent a lot of money on it. And we wanted their help then. And then when we were done, we said, okay, we don't want your help. We don't want to pay taxes, right? So, again, I think the Americans were ultimately in the right, but it wasn't a completely hostile, wrong point that the British had. And I think people recognize that. And you see it a lot in when you're reading Thomas Gage, the leader, the general who led the Royal Forces. He was good friend. He would serve with George Washington, right? It was a much better, closer group of people who had honest disagreement, but heard one another, listened to one another. I think everybody, that's why the shot heard around the world has such significance. Everybody to the last minute, Ron, and you probably come across some people were hoping against hope that it wouldn't have to come to this. Nobody wanted to have to kill one another and have all these, 22-year-old people are dying, right? So yes, it's for an ideal, and we honor them, but still they, So I think that it's a little bit of that one. Sometimes when I see, and then it's amplified by social media, of course, but people on either side so angry at the others in a way that, look, I'm sure there was some of that then, but in a way that just isn't productive and doesn't need to be. Like they listen to each other in a different way.
Yeah, that would be quite amazing if both parties in current political climate, if they would actually, they say they listen to the other side, but I don't think they do.
Just find some common ground, and
Yeah,
I think
there's got to be something.
There's some common ground, right? There might be a lot of uncommon ground, but we're all human beings and we live in America, and like there's some common ground, obviously, right?
Amen.
So,
Amen. I think you mentioned Thomas Gage. I mean, you're right. I think he was too good of friends, because he wouldn't enforce anything, and he wouldn't well, I could do this and I could do this, but maybe not. And he got to the point where King said, dude, you're not doing anything to stop this. So he, recalled him and all that. But man, can you imagine having that kind of relationship where you could have a disagreement and not, say, I'm the boss and, go shoot somebody, or no, I'm right, you're wrong, and therefore it's my way. I mean, that's kind of how it is.
It's getting off topic, but I'll just say it because it sounds like a place where we exchange ideas. You talked about I think you had a background in the military, and your family does. Somebody was saying to me how I heard somebody say it. I can't remember whether it was an older, either Republican or Democrat. I literally can't remember. Was saying that there was a time in the Senate when so many of the senators had been in the war, had served in the military on both sides, and this in itself gave them a common ground. This meant that they had a respect for one another. Even if they disagreed terribly on how much to tax or whatever the social issue might have been, they respected one another. There's far fewer of those people now in Congress on either side. Yeah, and I think that's been. I'm just thinking about it. You're talking about that. That's yet another divide in place. There's not a common place.
Yeah, it's very divisive. But the divisiveness today versus the divisiveness back then, I mean, is a lot of different reasons, and TV and text and social media and all that. But all right, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and it's kind of like wrapping it up a little bit. But if you had to describe Paul Revere in just 3 words, what would they be?
Able, direct, courageous.
Courageous. I love it.
Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the fulfilling work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.
If you could, later on tonight, sit down with Paul Revere at dinner, what is 1 or 2 questions that you would ask him?
When did you realize that that your mission had been successful? And at what point did you think you might die?
Can you imagine having that conversation? gives me goosebumps, but I'm a history nerd. So is there another historical event that doesn't have to be, in the Revolutionary War era, but is there another historical event that you would like to, or maybe are thinking about writing about in the future?
I don't honestly have an answer to that. There are a few things I'm kind of kicking around in my alleged head, but I haven't gotten there quite yet. Okay. So just going to pass on that one.
All right. Last question before we open it up to anything else you want to share is, if this book is turned into a movie, who would you cast as Paul Revere?
Are you free? You want to do it, Mom?
I don't know. Yeah, I'll do it. Sure, I'll do it. I'll take it on.
I know I've thought about a few different people. Toby Maguire, we know he looks good on the back of a horse, right?
Oh, yeah.
Seabiscuit. It's got to be somebody who's physical, has a can handle himself. He's somebody that comes to mind. I know Casey Affleck is from Boston. He's had a little bit of stuff. But there's some there. I think you want an able person. Revere was 40, so it doesn't have to be the youngest person. It can be a person of middle age. Those two come to mind as possibilities.
I've seen I think every documentary and although there's not many movies about George Washington, but mostly there's documentaries or docuseries. But when I picture George Washington, there's one series that gets George Washington exactly how I feel he would look, exactly, more importantly, how he would sound. And that's Turn, which was, a series, but people always say it's highly inaccurate. And I have to disagree. Turn's fairly accurate. They take some liberties, obviously, but you have to have the right, or if you cast the right person to be Paul Revere, you want it to be believable. So maybe somebody from Boston. Is there anything else that you want to share about?
Yeah, I could see Adam Driver doing it too. Adam Driver's another person. See him doing it. I think you can't have somebody with a too heavy a Boston accent or too heavy a British accent, right?
Right.
It's not. Anyway, Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Now I'm thinking about it. Anthony, you're gonna write to all these guys after we're done, right?
Oh yeah, they're in my phone. Yeah, I'll just send them a text, right?
Cool. Sounds good.
Well, I just I know you're super busy, and I really appreciate you taking time out for this. And any final thoughts, or have we covered all of it?
I think you did a wonderful job. I appreciate the time with you. I'm looking forward. The book officially comes out on March 25th. I'm excited for it. I had a wonderful time reporting it. The people I got to meet, the descendants of Revere, people around the Old North Church, and so on. I appreciate the conversation. Wonderful talking with you.
Everybody, you need to get this book. It's 266 pages of history, but it's much more than that. If you're listening on the podcast, just as always, look in the notes. I'm going to have links on how you can purchase his book once it's available. And I'll have links to Kostya, and so you can explore him. If anybody wants to reach out, I know you probably have a publicist and you're not just, on Facebook and people message you. But if somebody really wanted to say, hey, I think I need to share something with you. Is there a way, or is it in the book, that how somebody can get in contact?
So I'm happy to share that. The book is. I will say the book is available for pre-order now, so you could.
Oh, good.
Order whenever they would like to, which is wonderful. I have a website, KostyaKennedy.com. That's the best way. You can go there. There's a contact form, and that's the best way to reach me.
Okay.
There's a contact way through the book too, if somebody prefers that. But either way.
Okay. Well, I feel a little special because I got it a little bit before you could buy it, and it's just a book that you need to read. And you know what? I think the really cool thing about your book is my circle is with people interested in the American Revolution. That's my life. But you don't even have to really be a history guy or gal, and you don't even really have to say, well, I don't care about the revolution or what. It's just a good, solid book as a standalone. So don't think that, I have to know this, or I have to be a certain. Get the book and read it, and share it with others, because the more that this gets out, one, it's going to help educate people, but there's so much in this that's so good. Look in the links on YouTube as well. All the links will be there. And again, Kostya, thank you so much for your time. I know you're super busy.
My pleasure, Ron. Really enjoyed this time with you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for listening and hope that you tune in next time with us here at the Patriot Power Podcast. Make sure that you hit subscribe so you'll get notified when our new episodes are available for you. And we hope that you check out our websites, which include our show notes, links, documents, and more at patriotpowerpodcast.com or ilovegeorgewashington.com. Until next time, hope that you and your family have a blessed week. And remember, be safe and tell a veteran thanks for their service.